Imagine, if you will, a world where the sun never sets on the reach of a single man's decree, where the very soil of three continents is held in the palm of one hand, and where the most powerful military machine ever devised by human ingenuity stands ready to crush any whisper of dissent. Now imagine that this entire apparatus, the cities, the legions, the gold, and the lives of 70 million people, is being sold to the highest bidder on a dusty rampart in the heart of Rome. This is not a fable of capitalist excess or a fever dream of a satirist. It is the cold, hard reality of the year 193 AD, a moment when the Roman Empire, the crowning achievement of Mediterranean civilization, was literally put under the auctioneer's hammer. It was a day when the purple robe of the Caesars became a mere commodity, and the dignity of a millennium was traded for a pile of silver. To understand how the world's greatest superpower reached such a nadir of soul and state, we must first look at the blood-slicked marble of the imperial palace on a cold New Year's Eve, where the seeds of this absurdity were first sown. The year 192 AD had ended in a way that was both shocking and inevitable. The Emperor Commodus, a man who believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules and who spent more time fighting gladiators in the arena than governing the state, had been strangled in his bath. His death marked the end of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, a period that had seen Rome reach its zenith of territorial expansion and internal stability. With Commodus gone, the Roman world stood at a crossroads. The conspirators who had removed the mad emperor had a plan, or at least the semblance of one. They needed a man of the old school, a man whose reputation for integrity and administrative competence could wash away the filth of the previous decade. They found that man in Publius Helvius Pertinax. Pertinax was in many ways the ultimate Roman success story. He was the son of a former slave, a charcoal burner who had somehow managed to provide his son with a decent education. Through sheer grit, military talent, and political navigation, Pertinax had risen from the lowest rungs of society to the highest. He had governed provinces, led legions, and served as the urban prefect of Rome. When the assassins of Commodus knocked on his door in the middle of the night, Pertinax initially believed they had come to execute him. Instead, they offered him the world. He accepted, perhaps out of a genuine sense of duty, or perhaps out of the same ambition that had fueled his rise from the charcoal pits. On January 1st, 193 AD, Pertinax was proclaimed emperor, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the golden age of Rome might be restored. But Pertinax made a fatal mistake. He forgot that the Roman Empire was no longer a republic of civic-minded citizens, nor was it the disciplined machine of Augustus. It was a military autocracy, and the true power lay with the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit of soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor. Under Commodus, the Guard had grown accustomed to luxury, license, and lack of discipline. They were pampered, overpaid, and deeply cynical. Pertinax, true to his austere roots, immediately began a program of radical reform. He sought to balance the imperial budget, which had been drained by the excesses of his predecessor. He sold off Commodus's collection of exotic concubines, golden chariots, and gladiator equipment. Most importantly, he insisted on military discipline. He tried to curb the Guard's power and promised them only half of the massive donative, or bribe, that they had come to expect upon the accession of a new ruler. For 87 days, Pertinax ruled with a firm hand, but the resentment in the Praetorian barracks was simmering. The guardsmen did not want a virtuous father of the country. They wanted a benefactor who would turn a blind eye to their corruption. On March 28, 193 AD, the tension finally snapped. A contingent of 300 disgruntled soldiers burst from their camp and marched through the streets of Rome toward the Palatine Hill. There was no organized resistance. The palace officials fled and the remaining guardsmen joined the mutineers. Pertinax, showing the courage that had defined his military career, refused to hide. He walked out to meet the soldiers, hoping to reason with them, to remind them of their oath and the dignity of the office he held. For a moment, his presence commanded respect. The soldiers hesitated. But then a lone spear was thrust forward, striking the emperor in the chest. The spell was broken. The soldiers swarmed him, and the dream of a restored republic died on the palace floor. The soldiers did not just kill the emperor, they decapitated him, fixing his head onto a spear and parading it back to their fortified camp, the Castor Praetoria. Rome was now a city without a leader, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The Senate huddled in terror, and the common people stayed behind locked doors. Inside the walls of the Praetorian camp, however, the atmosphere was one of chaotic calculation. The soldiers realized they held the ultimate prize, but they also knew they lacked a candidate of their own. They were not interested in governing, they were interested in being paid. It was then that one of the most bizarre events in human history began to unfold. Sulpicianus, the father-in-law of the murdered Pertinax and the current urban prefect, had been sent to the camp earlier to try and pacify the troops. Now he found himself in a peculiar position.
He was inside the camp, surrounded by the men who had just killed his son-in-law, and he began to offer them money to support his own claim to the throne. He promised each soldier 5,000 drachmas if they would proclaim him emperor. It was a desperate move, but it gave the soldiers an idea. Why settle for the first offer? Why not see what the market could bear? The soldiers climbed onto the ramparts of their camp and began to shout to the city below. They announced that the Roman Empire was for sale. They declared that they would bestow the title of Augustus upon whoever could pay the highest price. It was a literal auction, conducted from the walls of a military base, with the greatest prize in history as the lot. News of this incredible proclamation spread through the terrified streets and reached the ears of a man named Marcus Didius Julianus. Julianus was a wealthy senator of immense means and even greater vanity. He was a man who had held every high office in the state, yet he was widely regarded as a buffoon, a man of little character and excessive greed. He was at a lavish banquet when word of the auction arrived. Encouraged by his wife and daughter, and perhaps fueled by the wine of the evening, Julianus decided that he must have the empire. He hurried to the gates of the Praetorian camp, but found himself barred by the soldiers. Undeterred, he began to shout his bids from the street below, while Sulpicius continued to bid from inside the camp. The scene was surreal. Sulpicius would offer a sum, and the soldiers would lean over the wall to inform Julianus. Julianus would then raise the price, screaming his offer into the darkening Roman sky. The two men, one inside and one out, engaged in a bidding war that would determine the fate of millions. The soldiers acted as the auctioneers, goading the two contenders, playing on their fears and their ambitions. It was a race to the bottom of moral dignity and the top of financial ruin. Sulpicius eventually reached his limit, offering 5,000 denarii per soldier. The guardsmen were pleased, but they turned to Julianus to see if he had one final card to play. Julianus, sensing the moment was slipping away, didn't just incrementalize the bid, he made a massive jump. He promised 25,000 sestertii to every single member of the guard, a sum that was equivalent to several years' salary for each soldier. It was an astronomical amount, a figure that would bankrupt the treasury, but the guardsmen didn't care about the treasury. They cared about the silver in their pockets. The gates of the camp swung open. Julianus was ushered inside, the new owner of the Roman world. The soldiers hoisted him onto their shoulders and proclaimed him emperor, while Sulpicius was simply allowed to go home. His bid was defeated by the sheer weight of Julianus's gold. The Senate, surrounded by an armed guard, had no choice but to confirm the appointment. As Julianus was led to the palace, he walked past the spot where Pertinax's blood was still drying on the floor. He sat down to a feast, convinced that he had achieved the ultimate victory. But as the sun rose on the first day of his reign, the reality of what he had bought began to dawn. He had purchased a throne, but he had not purchased loyalty, respect, or a future. He had bought a target, and the rest of the Roman world was about to respond to the sale with a fury that would set the empire ablaze.
Didius Julianus did not sleep well that first night. The palace of the Caesars, once a symbol of divine right and unshakable authority, now felt like a gilded cage he had paid far too much for. The feast he sat before was originally prepared for Pertinax, a man whose blood still stained the stones of the courtyard outside. Julianus ate, but the wine must have tasted like copper and ash. He looked at his wife, Manlia Scantilla, and his daughter, Didia Clara, who were now technically the most powerful women in the known world, yet their faces reflected a growing, silent dread. They knew, as he was slowly starting to realize, that a crown bought with coins is only as heavy as the metal used to pay for it. He had achieved his lifelong ambition, but he had done so at the exact moment the office of emperor lost its sanctity. The following morning, the Roman populace provided the first major shock to his system. Usually, a new emperor was greeted with choreographed cheers, or at least a respectful, calculated silence from the masses. Not Julianus. When he walked to the Senate house, escorted by the very Praetorians who had sold him the office, the crowds did not cheer. They hissed. They shouted thief and traitor from the shadows of the porticos. They threw stones and filth at his litter. This was not the distant, respectful awe a ruler expects. This was the visceral disgust of a people who realized their dignity had been listed on an auction block and sold to a man they didn't even like. Julianus, ever the lawyer, tried to argue his legal legitimacy to anyone who would listen, but you cannot litigate your way into the hearts of an angry mob. The second shock was found in the imperial ledger. Julianus was a wealthy man, one of the wealthiest in Rome, but the Praetorian guard's demand, 25,000 sesterces per man, totaled a sum that would have made even the most profligate emperors wince. He went to the treasury, expecting to find the accumulated wealth of nations. Instead, he found the echoes of Commodus' vanity and the remnants of Pertinax's failed attempts at austerity. The coffers were nearly dry. Julianus had promised a fortune he did not actually have in liquid assets. To bridge the gap, he began to devalue the currency, stripping the silver content of the denarius to make the coins go further, and started a frantic fire sale of imperial property.
He was essentially the CEO of a bankrupt firm trying to pay off a hostile takeover loan by selling the office furniture. But while Julianus struggled with the mathematics of his mistake in Rome, the news of the auction was traveling with terrifying speed. It traveled along the paved veins of the empire, reaching the frontiers where the real power of Rome resided, the legions. To a soldier stationed on the Danube or the Euphrates, the Praetorian Guard were pampered carpet knights who spent their days in the shade of the capital while the frontier armies bled for every inch of Roman soil. The news that these palace guards had auctioned the empire to the highest bidder was more than a political shift. It was a profound, unbearable insult to their profession. In the east, Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria, saw his opportunity. Niger was a man of the people, well liked by the troops and the citizens of Antioch. He was known for his strict discipline and his approachability. When the news of the auction reached him, his legions did not wait for his command. They hailed him as Augustus immediately. Niger was confident, perhaps dangerously so. He held the wealthy eastern provinces, controlled the grain of Egypt, and occupied the strategic heart of the Levant. He believed that the Roman people would naturally gravitate toward him as the savior who would cleanse the capital of Julianus' stench. He took his time, consolidating power and throwing games, savoring the adulation of the east, assuming the crown would wait for him. But in the north, at the fortress of Carnuntum on the frozen banks of the Danube, there was a man who did not believe in taking his time. Septimius Severus, the governor of Upper Pannonia, was a different breed of Roman entirely. Born in Leptis Magna in North Africa, he was a pragmatist with a heart of iron and a mind like a razor. When his soldiers heard of the auction, they were furious. Severus, however, channeled that fury into a cold, calculated march. He didn't just want the throne, he wanted the total liquidation of the old order that had allowed such a farce to occur. Severus knew he had two problems: Julianus in front of him and Clodius Albinus, the governor of Britain, behind him. Albinus commanded 3 elite legions and was a man of high birth and considerable influence. If Severus marched on Rome, Albinus could easily cross the Channel and seize Gaul, or even follow him into Italy to strike at his back. In a masterstroke of cynical diplomacy, Severus sent a secret message to Albinus. He didn't offer a fight, he offered a title. He offered to make Albinus his Caesar, his heir and junior partner in power. Albinus, perhaps blinded by the sudden prestige, or perhaps underestimating the African general's long-term ruthlessness, accepted the deal. With his rear secured, Severus turned his gaze toward the Alps. The march of the Pannonian legions was legendary for its sheer, unrelenting speed. Severus did not wait for a formal campaign season to begin. He did not wait for the baggage trains to be perfect or the weather to clear. He marched his men at a grueling pace, often walking on foot alongside them in the mud to show he shared their every burden. He was not just a general, he was the personification of the frontier's revenge against the decadence of the capital. He bypassed major obstacles and ignored the usual protocol of war, focused entirely on the prize. Back in Rome, Julianus was spiraling into a state of visible panic. Every courier brought worse news than the last. First, he heard that Niger had been proclaimed in the east. Then came the terrifying news that Severus, the man with the largest army closest to Italy, was already moving. The Senate, sensing the wind shifting with every passing hour, began to distance themselves from the man they had confirmed only weeks prior. Julianus tried to declare Severus a public enemy, but the decree felt hollow. Who was the real public enemy? The grim general coming to restore the honor of the army, or the man who had bought the empire like a head of cattle? In a desperate, frantic bid to defend the city, Julianus turned Rome into a chaotic construction site. He tried to fortify the suburbs, but the Praetorians, his loyal buyers, proved to be worse than useless. These men were used to parades, theater, and intimidation, not actual siege warfare against battle-hardened veterans. Julianus even tried to train the palace elephants for battle, a scene that historians of the time described as bordering on the farcical. The great beasts, unused to the clamor of war and the stench of blood, were more of a danger to the Romans than to any invader. He even attempted to use gladiators as a makeshift militia, a sign of true, pathetic desperation. The atmosphere in Rome turned surreal and dark. Julianus began to resort to magic and ancient superstition. He performed strange, forbidden sacrifices, seeking omens in the entrails of animals, hoping for a divine intervention that his money simply could not buy. He even sent assassins to find Severus, but the Pannonian legions were an impenetrable wall of steel. Severus's scouts were already being spotted in northern Italy. The cities of the north, rather than resisting the advance, were opening their gates with relief. They saw the writing on the wall. Ravenna, the great naval base, fell without a single arrow being fired. The fleet, the very thing that could have blocked Severus's path by sea, went over to him immediately. Julianus was now a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by people who were already planning his funeral. He offered to share the empire with Severus, sending a formal delegation to propose a co-rule. Severus did not even bother to respond personally to the offer. He knew he did not have to share what he was about to take by force. The Praetorians, realizing that Severus's veterans would butcher them if they stood by Julianus, began to desert in droves. They were mercenaries at heart, and they were not willing to die for a man whose checks were likely to bounce, and whose cause was clearly lost. The Senate, ever the weather vane of Roman power, met in secret. They could see the Pannonian standards through their metaphorical telescopes, and hear the drums of the approaching legions. They realized that to save their own lives, they had to sacrifice the man they had so recently elected. The transition from Julianus being the princeps to Julianus being a dead man walking happened in the span of a single cold afternoon. The senators, who once bowed to him, now drafted the order for his execution. The man who had bought the world was now worth less than the dirt beneath his feet. He sat in the palace, the same halls where he had toasted his victory 66 days earlier, listening to the terrifying silence of an empty house. The guards were gone, the servants had fled, the owner of the Roman Empire was entirely alone, waiting for the inevitable heavy footsteps in the hallway. The auction was over, and the bill had finally come due in blood. But the death of Julianus would not be the end of the chaos. It was merely the opening act of a massive civil war that would stretch from the rainy hells of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of the east. The three generals, Severus, Niger, and Albinus, had all tasted the possibility of the purple, and only one would be left standing. As Severus's vanguard reached the outskirts, the city held its breath, knowing the era of the high-stakes gamble had ended, and the era of the sword had begun. Julianus's reign was a fever dream, but the waking world was going to be much, much bloodier. The auctioneer had left the stage, but the price of Rome was still rising.
The silence in the Palatine was not the peaceful quiet of a home at rest. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb before the stone is finally rolled into place. Didius Julianus, the man who had bought the world with a promise of sesterces he could never truly deliver, sat in the flickering shadows of the imperial apartments. He had outlived his relevance by several weeks, and his authority by several more. When the small detachment of soldiers finally burst through the heavy oak doors, there was no grand defense, no final stand by a loyal guard, and no heroic defiance. There was only a trembling old man and a singular, pathetic question that echoed off the polished marble walls. What evil have I done? Whom have I killed? It was the plea of a merchant who believed life was a series of ledger entries, unaware that in the game of empires, the only currency that never devalues is steel. The soldiers did not answer with words. They simply did what they were paid to do, and Julianus's head was soon displayed on the rostra, a grim receipt for a transaction gone horribly wrong. His reign had lasted 66 days, roughly the same amount of time a moderately successful merchant might spend waiting for a shipment of grain from Alexandria. Septimius Severus did not enter Rome as a conqueror, at least not at first. He understood the value of theater. He entered the city in civilian dress, a gesture of respect to the Senate that fooled absolutely no one. Behind him, however, marched the iron-shod reality of the Pannonian legions. The city was flooded with soldiers who looked nothing like the pampered Praetorians the Romans were used to. These were men from the frontiers, hardened, sunburnt, and smelling of the damp forests of the Danube. They did not care for the delicate social dances of the capital. They cared for the man who had promised them the world. Severus's first act was not one of celebration, but of systematic administrative cleansing. He understood that the auction of the empire was made possible only by the decadence of the Praetorian Guard, the very body that was supposed to be the ultimate guarantor of imperial stability. Severus summoned the guard to a vast plain outside the city walls. He commanded them to appear in their finest ceremonial dress, unarmed, to swear their new oaths of allegiance. The Praetorians, perhaps hoping for a fresh bribe or a continuation of their privileged lifestyle, complied. They stood in the shimmering heat, their polished breastplates reflecting the sun, a vision of military splendor that was entirely hollow. As they stood in formation, Severus's seasoned, battle-hardened legions quietly surrounded